so much for coming. My name is Henrietta Breedin, and I have devised this entertainment, My Dearest Hedgehog, that we're going to do for you tonight as a companion piece to Intermezzo, which Garsington Opera are performing in the summer. And it is a thinly disguised portrait of Strauss's own marriage to Pauline, a woman who was definitely prickly enough to earn herself the name of Hedgehog. And what we're doing with this evening is giving a little bit of a look behind the scenes at what brought these two very unlikely people together. And we've assembled a magnificent collection of performers led by Penny Downey and Oliver Cotton. And accompanist Nicholas Fletcher.
That song was one of three written by Richard Strauss between the 17th and the 22nd of May, 1894, for his fiancée, Pauline, a few months before they married. It seems extraordinary that such soaringly sensuous music should have been dedicated to a woman whom contemporaries described as abrasive and tactless, moody and domineering, who often belittled and picked quarrels with her husband in public, whose intense jealousy led her to throw regrettable and damaging tantrums.
People also said that he would never have achieved such success without her support and constant encouragement. He was naturally lazy, you know.
Oh, was that his view or hers, I wonder? At any rate, it all started very much as a teacher-pupil relationship. When they met in 1887, Strauss was 23 and deeply in love, not just with another woman, but a married one, 4 years his senior. On a visit to his aunt's villa on Lake Starnberg, near Munich, he met her neighbours, Major General Adolf de Anna, his wife Maria, and their 24-year-old daughter, Paulina. It was at first only Paulina's voice which caught Strauss's interest. She had studied singing at the Munich School of Music and privately with an old school friend of Strauss's. After he had given her a few lessons, Strauss wrote to his friend, "She's much more talented than you think. We've only to bring her gifts out." And he sent her off for acting lessons and to be coached in some carefully selected operatic roles. Now, Strauss's career was definitely in the ascendant. He had been appointed to the position of Kapellmeister in Weimar, where his work on Wagner's Lohengrin led the composer's widow, Cosima, to lavish on him what he referred to as colossal praise. In fact, he reports that she became quite moved and even kissed me. Paulina, in the meantime, was studying hard, and in 1890 she came to Weimar to sing at Strauss's suggestion Pamina in Mozart's The Magic Flute. It was her stage debut, and he wrote to his sister afterwards that her success exceeded all expectations.
Unfortunately, Paulina never made a recording, so we can never know what her voice sounded like. But she sang a wide range of roles in Weimar, from Eva in Der Meistersinger and Elizabeth in Tannhäuser to Leonora in Fidelio and both Donna Anna and Donna Elvira in Don Giovanni. Her own self-assessment was unflinchingly trenchant. Sugary was how she described herself as Donna Anna, and she considered her Elvira to be too dainty and much too fluting, too lovable and German in expression and acting, not a Spanish woman thirsting for revenge. But Strauss thought that her Elsa in Lohengrin was fabulous and magnificently acted. A few years later, she tackled Wagner's Isolde, which Strauss said in one of his memoirs, which was too early, of course, but somehow because of her youth and acting, a particularly charming performance. The notion of a charming Isolde is quite intriguing.
It must have been around this time that Strauss began to see Paulina as something more than an eager pupil, and their letters reflect this shift in their relationship. To begin with, Paulina addressed Strauss formally as dear and most esteemed Herr Kapellmeister, and she was his dear Fräulein de Anna. But he was clearly giving detailed consideration to her musical career, advising her on which operatic roles she should consider. For example, he pointed out that if she agreed to sing the small role of a flower maiden in Parsifal for Cosima Wagner at Bayreuth, she would be giving herself an improved chance of being considered as Elizabeth in Tannhäuser. She was full of admiration for him and signed herself your devoted student. It wasn't long before he was enclosing a small Christmas present, a volume of Goethe's verses, and not long after that, she showed a first flash of temper, rejecting his advice and causing him to retreat into a wounded and dignified silence. His father advised him to be patient with Fräulein de Anna, who seems rather giving to overexciting herself. Strauss began work on his first opera, Guntram, writing the central role of Freihild for Paulina, a woman who is first seen attempting to drown herself because her husband has forbidden her to help the poor. It was a tale of thwarted love and noble, if needless, renunciation, set in 13th century Germany, heavily indebted to Wagner and throbbing with suppressed hothouse emotion. In later years, Strauss was to marvel at his own hair-raising naivety in putting the tenor Heinrich Zeller, who sang Guntram, through agonies with the challenges of his insanely demanding role. Somebody calculated that the role had more bars of music than Tristan, and poor Zeller grew hoarser and hoarser with each rehearsal, eventually struggling to get through the first performance. Pauline managed better, but at one of the final rehearsals, when Strauss was obliged, as he put it, to rap with my baton to stop and correct Zeller countless times, she worked herself into a fury because she was not being corrected, thinking that she was being overlooked. "Why don't you stop me?" she demanded. And when Strauss pointed out that she knew her part perfectly well and she didn't need correcting, she burst out, "I want to be stopped," threw her score at him and stormed out of the room.
It was more than just performance nerves that provoked this outburst from Pauline. By that time, she and Strauss had, in fact, been secretly engaged to be married for some weeks. The official announcement of their engagement was made on the day of Guntram's premiere, May the 10th, 1894. She was clearly very much in love with Strauss, but had been tormented by doubts and misgivings, showing what was probably a painful lack of self-confidence despite all her surface bluster and bravura.
At the end of 1892, having been extremely ill with pleurisy and bronchitis, Strauss had set off on an 8-month-long health-restoring trip to Italy, Greece, and Egypt, an experience which gave him invaluable time to read and think and develop his ideas. He worked his way through volumes of Goethe, Nietzsche, and Schopenhauer, followed by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Plato, and gained inspiration for much of his later work from Salome and Electra to the Egyptian Helen. On his return, after he and Pauline had been apart for nearly a year, he proposed marriage to her. She was 31 years old, and he was not quite 30.
And she wrote him a letter revealing her intense vulnerability and her deep fear of beginning a new life, devoting herself to someone else's happiness at what would have been considered at the time a very late age. "My dear Herr Strauss," she wrote, still so formal, "this is all descending on me like an unexpected shower bath. You know better than anyone how many faults I have. Will I be capable of being what you want? Must I suddenly become a model housewife? Do your parents really like me? Should I not fulfill my guest engagement at Hamburg so that I may at least have a success to be proud of for you, my most respected teacher? Oh, we don't really need to marry so soon. Oh, forgive me. I'm almost incapable of reasoning. Please, be patient."
Strauss was patient, as he so frequently had to be during the course of their long married life together. He waited while Pauline struggled to suppress her misgivings. She would say in later years that her parents had opposed the marriage because it was beneath her, as a general's daughter, to marry a lowly musician, son of a horn player. But this was not the case. The de Annas gave the match their wholehearted blessing, and her father warned her that if she turned him down, Strauss would be so mortified that she could never again expect him to teach her or to help her in any way. Her sister urged her to give up this eternal struggling and to stop making herself needlessly unhappy. But Strauss must have known that she'd come round in the end, and despite his own seemingly phlegmatic temperament, he too was capable of strong emotion, a turbulence and uncertainty that emerged in his music. He wrote this for Pauline on the eve of their wedding. did not get off to a particularly easy start. After prolonged negotiations, Strauss had accepted a job as chief conductor at the Munich Opera, but there were endless disagreements and broken promises about singing engagements for Paulina, and close to Strauss's heart, performances of Guntram. In the end, there was only one performance in Munich, and it was pretty much a disaster. The singers and the orchestra players all complained bitterly about the impossible demands of the music, and the local press had a field day, picking up on the backstage gossip and accusing the composer of assassinating music.
Paulina had one row after another with Strauss's parents when they spent an ill-advised summer holiday together. For Strauss, there were conducting engagements to fulfill, but Paulina, setting a precedent that was to become a pattern, rarely accompanied him. Over and again, she considered going with him on his travels, but invariably changed her mind, finding excuses and reasons for staying at home. She fretted over his health and well-being while he was away and made numerous lists of items to pack for him. Richard for Berlin. 4 stiff shirts, 1 nightshirt, 2 underpants, 2 undervests, 4 pairs of socks, 18 handkerchiefs, sponge bag, dressing gown, slippers, travelling cushion.
And Strauss missed her. He wrote to her almost every day because, as he said, I need to have a chat with you, even if it has to be at a distance. In 1896, about 18 months after their wedding, he was in Moscow and addressing her by one of the pet names he had coined for her, my dearest Wolfson. Here I am, safe and sound. The Russian sleeper from Warsaw was extremely comfortable and warm, with double windows and no coal dust, as it's all heated by wood. I passed the time royally, eating, sleeping, reading and composing, and I was completely fresh and lively when we bowled into holy Moscow. Everyone, even ladies on their way to concerts in décolleté gowns, drives around in open sleighs, no higher off the ground than our own toboggans. You're likely to get a horse's nose in your neck at any moment. First rehearsal is tomorrow at 10. Oh, I shall have a lot to tell you. I'm as fit as a fiddle, so far as that's possible without you, my dearest darling. So don't worry about me. It's midnight, and the bells are ringing. They're beautifully tuned. 1,000 good wishes and kisses. Your R.
On a rare occasion when Paulina overcame her dislike of travel, he was full of tender and affectionate advice, telling her to order coffee and rolls to be brought to her on the train to Brussels so that she didn't have to leave the compartment and risk catching cold. He recommended a tip of 2 marks for the porter, and that on arrival she should first inquire about the official omnibus provided by the hotel in which he had booked a room, with heating. But if there was any problem at all, she was to take a hansom cab and hang the expense. He urged her to dress smartly, to bring 1 dress and hat too many rather than too few, and to buy everything she needed, gloves, etc., before leaving Munich, as Brussels was much more expensive.
They both enjoyed their food. He told her about the delicious caviar with schnapps he had been given in Moscow, and they often had friends to supper in Munich, and later to rather grander, more formal affairs in Berlin and Vienna. His sweet tooth and his fondness for rosehip jam are often referred to in the libretto for his opera Intermezzo. She kept a recipe book and a detailed record of their dinners, the guests who came, and the food that they were given.
And for a while, always encouraged by Strauss, who never expected her to give up her career, she continued to sing professionally. They gave Lieder recitals together with him at the piano, and all his songs were written with her voice in mind. He always said that she was the ideal interpreter of his songs and asked in his letters whether she was keeping her voice in trim. Are you singing a lot? Not properly. For a long time and with full voice?
She was. But her efforts were interrupted significantly by becoming pregnant. In April 1897, she gave birth to a giant boy, as Strauss described him, large enough for a doctor to have predicted twins. His size put both his life and Paulina's in danger, and he was named Richard in an emergency baptism. But as Strauss reported, I shall overrule that. We'll call him Franz. He became known as Bubi and was adored by both his parents, who never had another child. And once he'd made his way into the world, he he found a lullaby waiting for him, composed by his father in anticipation, 2 months earlier. Strauss was sustained and refreshed all his life by the comfort and routine of his home life, frequently incorporating details of that life in his compositions. His tone poem, Ein Heldenleben, contains a musical portrait of Pauline as the hero's consort. It's my wife I want to portray, he said. She's very complex, very much a woman, never twice alike, every minute different to what she was the minute before. He became so enmeshed in the daily concerns of his little family that he immortalized them in his Symphonia Domestica. When the next chapter of the artist's hero, now settled and contented, despite the occasional quarrel with his wife and child, to Strauss it was absolutely natural to depict his own life in musical terms. But some critics professed to be shocked at such artistic narcissism and at the intimacy of the scenes represented. A child being given a bath and put to bed, a couple disagreeing, cosy family supper.
Ironically, Strauss wrote the first sketches for the Symphonia Domestica while having a brief break on the Isle of Wight from conducting a series of concerts in London. While he was busy extolling the joys of family life, Paulina, back home in Berlin, was consulting a lawyer and sending her husband a telegram asking for a divorce. All as the result of a misunderstanding which many years later was to form a key episode in another highly autobiographical work by Strauss, his 1924 opera Intermezzo.
Strauss was not given to public expressions of his feelings. He was a reticent man, seen by some as cold and distant, but his deep capacity for emotion, along with a strong streak of sensuality, emerge over and over again in his music. The swooning eroticism of the prelude to Act 1 of Der Rosenkavalier, the tender rapture of the love duet in Act 2 of Arabella, and the glorious inevitability of Arabella's reconciliation with Mandrika at the end of that opera. Despite this apparent division between the outer and the inner man, there was very little division between Strauss the composer and Strauss the family man. He didn't like to lock himself away. He preferred to work with the humdrum business of the household going on all around him. Booby playing in a corner, assaulted beloved dogs running around, Paulina discussing menus with the cook. Alfred Karlisch, the music critic who was an early champion of Strauss's work outside Germany and who made English singing translations of many of his operas, described him as being fastidiously methodical in his working methods. His writing table a model of neatness, which would put to shame the most precise of businessmen. Manuscripts and sketchbooks arranged, indexed, and docketed with scrupulous care. His scores a miracle of clearness and musical calligraphy.
Paulina told Kalisch, say what you like about his music, and of course she always did. But if you don't praise his handwriting, he'll be really cross. She insisted on him having plenty of exercise, usually in the form of a daily walk, convinced that the fresh air was the best possible protection against him having any further trouble with his lungs. He sometimes complained that there was no point in her being so solicitous about his health, as the howling draughts that swept through the house via the windows that she constantly flung open would probably finish him off anyhow.
At Garmisch, the big villa which they had built at the foot of the Bavarian Alps, and which would be their home base for more than 40 years, there was invariably a heavy winter snowfall. Strauss would take Bubi tobogganing, and in later years his grandsons, Richard and Christian. He and Paulina were skilled and graceful skaters of a dignified disposition, but he had a low opinion of skiing, considering it a pastime for Norwegian country postmen.
But domestic bliss could never have been an easy option for Paulina. She was maddened by the tedium of household responsibilities, but convinced that only she could organise matters satisfactorily. Strauss depicted this with disconcerting frankness in his libretto for Intermezzo, basing the two central characters, Christina and her conductor husband, Robert Storch, unmistakably on Paulina and himself. As the opera opens, she is helping him pack for a very long trip away. Oh, God! How I long for some peace and quiet once I'm alone here.
It's not as if I get in your way.
Simply by you being there, you get in my way. Your perpetual presence. Other husbands go off to the office, and the extra work you make.
Yes, but not for you.
For whom, then?
For our poor servants.
Yeah, but it is I who gives the orders here. I have to supervise everything and make sure that everything is done properly. It's exhausting.
Well, then give it up. There's no need for you to do it.
Everything would quickly go to pieces.
Oh, come on, you old charwoman. Thousands and thousands of families live their lives more simply and possibly more smoothly than we do. Oh, well, they carry on like that for quite a while, Christine getting on her high horse and Robert attempting to coax her back into a good mood. To Strauss and Paulina, their daily life was too real and immediate to be the knockabout comedy act that it sometimes borders on in Intermezzo, even though Strauss often tried a little gentle teasing to bring his volatile wife back down to earth. The singer, Lotte Lehmann, visited them often at Garmisch and described how she once caught a glance or a smile passing between Paulina and her husband, touching in its love and happiness. And I began to sense something of the profound affection between these two human beings, a tie so elemental in strength that none of Paulina's shrewish truculence could ever trouble it seriously.
It was perceptive of Lehmann to have sensed this bond between the couple. She was amazed by Paulina's behaviour, her outbursts of anger when she shouted at her husband and told him that his music couldn't compare with that of Massenet. At the time, Paulina had a daily massage, which she swore was essential to maintain her supple and trim figure. But she shrieked with pain throughout, hurling abuse at the unfortunate masseurs. Strauss made sure to take his daily walk whenever this was going on. But despite everything, he confided to Lehmann, "Believe me, Lottie, the whole world's admiration interests me considerably less than a single one of Paulina's fits of rage." For Paulina, determined to keep Strauss from putting on artistic airs, always trying to keep his feet firmly planted on the ground, the possibility of him finding love and fulfillment elsewhere was very real, even though he never seems to have given her even the slightest cause for suspicion. You see, behind the formidable facade she presented to the world, she was intensely vulnerable, And when she thought, quite wrongly, that she had found proof of her husband's dalliance with another woman, she was easy prey to the most sickening and irrational jealousy.
In the spring of 1902, Strauss, blamelessly drafting ideas for his Sinfonia Domestica on the Isle of Wight, was astonished to receive a telegram from Paulina requesting a divorce, followed by a package of his unopened letters. He then discovered that she started closing up their house in Berlin and had withdrawn 2,000 marks in gold from their bank account. What on earth had happened?
Just before Strauss left for England, Paulina had opened a letter addressed to him and found a note from a woman called Mitzemuka, saying that she was sorry not to have seen Herr Strauss at the Union Bar the day before, but hoped that he could let her have some concert tickets, signing off, "Yours sincerely." Hardly a torrid love letter. But to Paulina, the more she read the note, the more she brooded and agonized over it, and the more obvious it seemed to her that this was evidence of adulterous behavior.
Strauss's response was a characteristic mix of exasperation, tolerant pragmatism, and humour. My dear Bauxel, this Muka business is so stupid. You open this precious document on Whit Monday and spend an entire week harbouring hideous resentment towards your adulterous husband, who sails off to England in blissful ignorance of the storm clouds gathering behind him. Your first act of revenge is to withdraw my beautiful money from the bank. I wish I knew what you were planning to do with 2,000 marks. I've never been to the Union Bar. I don't even know where it is, any more than I know who Muka is. He's probably confused me with someone else. After all, Berlin also boasts Edmund von Strauss, Oscar Strauss. It's a beautiful afternoon here. And it's been quite spoiled for me when I was planning a stroll in God's glorious nature. And yesterday I'd begun composing something really nice. For now, loving greetings and kisses from the adulterer to yourself and Buber. Still, for the time being, at any rate, your Richard. The storm blew over and all was forgiven, if not entirely forgotten. Strauss knew and loved his Paulina, as he explains through the character of Robert Storch in Intermezzo. For me, she's made a perfect wife. She's what I need. I need someone who's fiery and lively around me. Everyone's possessed of two natures. The difference is this: there are some who only show their good side, fine people who present an agreeable surface. But she really is one of those gentle, shy and tender creatures, but rough on the outside, like a hedgehog, all spiny and prickly. In her, he found abundant happiness. Glückes genug. Paulina was not the first woman in Strauss's life to suffer cruelly from raw nerves. His mother, Josefina, was prey to what would now be labelled chronic depression. His father, Franz, was a quick-tempered virtuoso horn player, an outspoken member of the Bavarian court orchestra, who brought his frustrations and insecurities home with him. As Strauss later remarked, "My father was very irascible. Making music with him was always rather an anxious pleasure." They clashed increasingly as Strauss developed his own musical ideas, and Josefina vainly attempted to keep the peace between them. This must have imposed a considerable strain on her, as, according to her son, she was so sensitive that she was unable to read much and frequently had to pay for visits to the theatre and concerts with sleepless nights. At the age of 47, just before Strauss's 21st birthday, she was admitted to a nursing home for treatment of unspecified nervous disorder. An overdose of morphine intended to calm her provoked a severe mental breakdown, and she remained in the home for 2 months, convinced that her family were persecuting her. 5 months later, she was obliged to return for a further 6 weeks. Although there was a period of relative calm after that, the illness recurred in 1894, and from then until her death in 1910, she was in and out of a variety of institutions. Strauss loved his gentle, hypersensitive mother, and it was perhaps as a reaction to the tense atmosphere in which he grew up that he developed his own laconic and disengaged attitude to life. He was determined that he himself would not give way to the sort of choleric outbursts in which his father had indulged, but chose a wife with a similarly explosive temperament.
Paulina might have found an outlet for her own frustrations in public performance, but despite a very successful tour of America in 1904, when she gave a number of leader recitals alongside the 35 concerts that her husband conducted, she decided to retire in 1906. She was horribly seasick on the transatlantic crossing, exhausted by the long railway journeys between cities, didn't enjoy the moving from one hotel to the other, and found all the dressing up she was obliged to do extremely tedious. It was also possible that she never made a full recovery from the ordeal of Booby's birth. Although at this point Strauss moved on from song composing to concentrate on other musical forms, he continued to associate Lieder with the sound of his wife's voice and the period in their lives when they performed together. It is also remarkable that many of his compositions were completed around the 10th of September, their wedding anniversary. Towards the end of his life, when he lay desperately ill in a clinic in Lausanne, his friend, the music publisher Ernest Roth, came to visit. As Roth wrote later, he and I could not remember the title of a song that begins with the line, "Du solltest nicht weinen." I mentioned this to Frau Paulina that evening, and without the slightest hesitation, she said, "The song is Befreit." With great earnestness, she added, "It is a very beautiful song." And in a well-sounding half voice, she sang it through to me.
Leise wirst du
After 1906, Paulina poured her energies into supporting and caring for her husband and son, but she retained the temperament of an artist while no longer being able to give it expression. Strauss respected her musical judgment, even though she could be fiercely critical, and her pride in the fact that she was a general's daughter resulted, certainly on one occasion, in her taking something of an unexpected viewpoint. The diplomat and diarist, Count Harry Kessler, dined with Strauss and Paulina in Berlin in 1926. She was assiduous in her attentions to the director, Max Reinhardt, constantly refilling his plate and his glass until he started to discuss Wojciech, a play by Buchner. She claimed that it was a worthless piece, and that nobody could be expected to concern themselves with the fate and troubled soul of a squalid non-commissioned officer. Kessler gently, if rather mischievously, observed that the opera Carmen also concerns the fate of a non-commissioned officer.
And so Strauss embarked on the extraordinary series of operas that were to establish him as the foremost composer of his day: Salome and Electra, Der Rosenkavalier, and Ariadne auf Naxos. At the same time, he became caught up in a campaign which would occupy him for the rest of his life: the protection of composers' copyright and performing rights. He was criticized by some for being money-grubbing and over-concerned with contractual detail, but it was not simply a matter of self-interest. He founded the League of German Composers in September 1898, spearheading a campaign to reform copyright laws. And by November, there were 250 members, all of whom, and their descendants, owe him a considerable debt of gratitude. As a conductor, he remained in demand, conducting not just his own works, but symphonies and operas by Mozart, Beethoven, and Wagner. Otto Strasser played under his direction in the Vienna Philharmonic and wrote that his gestures were simple and clear, the baton moving within a small area. Frequent changes of tempo, as in Salome and Electra, for example, caused him no trouble. And I noticed that he used to turn back the pages of the score to check something while his right hand went on beating with absolute certitude. The tempos he gave us were individual, often idiosyncratic. In his own words, music could be anything at all, but must never be boring. He applied this rule to his own works too, and I often thought to myself, during performances of Rosenkavalier, when other conductors lingered over some beautiful passages, extracting every last drop for them, how much more lightly the composer took them. Strauss wrote a tongue-in-cheek list of golden rules for conductors, which included, you should not perspire when conducting. Only the audience should get warm. Never look encouragingly at the brass. If you think they're not playing loudly enough, tone it down, another notch or two. Never let the horns and woodwind out of your sight. If you can hear them at all, they're too loud. It's not enough if you can hear every word of a singer. After all, you know the text by heart. The audience must be able to follow without effort. If they can't hear the words, they'll go to sleep.
With so much going on in his professional and creative life, of course, he needed to relax, to indulge in the occasional diversion. Unfortunately, at any rate in Paulina's opinion, his favourite and most frequently indulged diversion was to play cards.
Skat, a three-handed German card game which Strauss had learned during his Weimar days and at which he became highly skilled. He was so fond of it that he created a skat corner in the villa at Garmisch, much to Paulina's disgust. He defended himself to the conductor, Karl Böhm. People criticize me because I enjoy playing skat so much. Böhm, I can assure you, when I'm playing, it's the only time I'm not working. Otherwise, there's always something else going on in my head. Now, he didn't like losing, but that may not have been so much on his own account as for fear of what Paulina would have to say if he ended up out of pocket. The great bass singer Hans Hotter was pulled into numerous skat games at the Salzburg Festival and at Garmisch, where he said that he learned from Strauss and his all-engrossing passion from the game, from his sophisticated tactics and his daredevil flashes of inspiration. Strauss confided to Hotter that music was so overwhelming for him that he could never escape from it. Everything in life had a sound, a potential melody, and the only thing that did not have a sound was cards, which he found a great relief. And Strauss created an entire operatic scene around a skat game at the beginning of Act 2 of Intermezzo. After the high-flown intensity of Die Frau ohne Schatten, with its heavily symbolic libretto by Hugo von Hofmannsthal, he wanted to compose something with a contemporary setting. Now, this didn't appeal to von Hofmannsthal, so Strauss approached the playwright and drama critic Hermann Bahr. He told him the old story of Mitzi Mücke and wrote to him with a detailed portrait of his wife and their relationship. She's extremely pedantic in her love of order and her passion for cleanliness. One of the subjects about which the couple frequently argue is that she can only ever see one way to attain a goal, whereas he will assess all the possibilities before choosing the most convenient and time-saving. She won't trust him not to get in a muddle, thinking he will absent-mindedly pay her bill twice or allow a tradesman to take advantage of his good nature and cheat him left and right. She frequently fails to listen properly when people are speaking to her, and often forgets when she's been asked a question what the question was or how she answered it, because she's convinced that her entire time is taken up with doing things for him. She begs him to be off and leave her on her own, but as soon as she goes away, she longs for his return. Hardly surprisingly, Bahr was thoroughly daunted by the prospect of treating such intimate subject matter and told Strauss that he really ought to tackle it himself, which Strauss duly did. He set to and completed a libretto within a week, an entirely naturalistic prose text which reflects the speech rhythms and everyday conversations of his own family life. What he did not do, according to all accounts, was to tell anyone else what he was writing.
Now, it seems unlikely, But apparently, Paulina had no idea that she was about to feature so identifiably in the opera until she sat down in her seat at the Dresden Semperoper on the 4th of November 1924. Neither did the Strausses' devoted and long-suffering maid, Anna. Both women were outraged. Lottie Lehmann, who sang Christina, told Paulina that she should consider it a great compliment and that it was a truly loving portrait. Paulina retorted, "I don't give a damn," and had such a tempestuous row with Strauss in the car while heading back to Garmisch the following day that their driver said afterwards he'd have preferred to have been outside in the real thunderstorm that was raging at the time. Anna left the household entirely and had to be coaxed back.
Strauss and Paulina were to live through 2 world wars and to endure times of comparative poverty, of fear, despair, and exile. But this outwardly unlikely pair remained devoted to one another. Their marriage was deep-rooted, and Strauss celebrated that by setting a poem written nearly 100 years earlier by Goethe for his own wife, Christiana. Now it was to be dedicated afresh to Strauss's wife, his dearest hedgehog. In 1930, nearly 40 years after they first met, Strauss was in Brussels, but thinking, as so often, of home. He said, I don't know if it's the same for you, he wrote, but my innermost sense of belonging to you grows stronger all the time. I think of you and the children all day long. I'm truly happy only when I'm with you, with our family. Nowhere is the air as good as in Garmisch, and nowhere is so lovely as in my own house, with my own beloved Bauxel, who is now most tenderly embraced by her own ever-faithful R. In those words, you can hear the music between them, between the violin and the horn, between the soprano and the piano, between the woman and the man, between Paulina and Richard Strauss.